When Larissa Harrington stepped into the coffee shop that winter afternoon, every head turned. Not in admiration, but in careful avoidance. The 20-year-old woman wore her long hair swept over the left side of her face, but it couldn't hide the burn scars that stretched from her forehead to her chin. People whispered behind their hands. A mother pulled her child closer. Someone's coffee cup paused midway to their lips. They all wondered the same thing. What was she doing here? Meeting that single dad who could barely afford his rent. When Larissa's breathing grew shallow and she turned to leave, ashamed, Finn Carter stood from his table. He walked straight toward her. She braced herself for rejection, for the polite excuse, for the look of horror. Instead, Finn gently reached out and took her trembling hand in his. The room fell silent. No one moved. And for the first time in 3 years, Larissa felt seen. But to understand how they arrived at that moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Finn Carter was 36 years old, and life had worn him down in ways that showed around his eyes. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built from years of physical labor. But there was a gentleness to him that contradicted his size. His face was kind, lined with exhaustion from working double shifts at a small auto repair garage on the outskirts of Phoenix. Every morning, he woke at 5 to pack his daughter's lunch. Every night, he fell asleep with grease still under his fingernails. His wife had left when their daughter was only 3 years old. She'd said she couldn't bear the poverty anymore, couldn't stand the small apartment and the broken-down car and the endless stretching of every dollar. She'd walked out on a Tuesday morning and never looked back. Finn had spent the years since then convinced of one thing. He would never be enough for anyone to love. His daughter, Seraphina, was 7 years old now. She had her mother's dark curls, but her father's steady brown eyes. She was polite and perceptive in the way children become when they've had to grow up faster than they should. She noticed when her father skipped meals so she could have seconds. She noticed when he counted coins at the grocery store. And she noticed, with the clarity only children possess, when adults were cruel or kind. Seraphina had one particular fear that haunted her young heart, that her mother might come back and take her father away, leaving her alone. She clung to Finn with a fierce, protective love. Larissa Harrington's life had been entirely different before the accident. Before the fire that changed everything, she had been beautiful in the conventional way people measure such things. She'd been the homecoming queen at her university, an accomplished pianist, vibrant and confident. Her father, Clinton Harrington, was a billionaire who'd made his fortune in real estate and technology. Larissa had grown up in a world of private schools and charity galas, where people smiled at her not just because of who she was, but because of who her father was. Then came the car accident 3 years ago. Larissa had been 23, riding with her stepmother to a family event. The vehicle had been T-boned at an intersection. Fuel leaked. Fire erupted. The door on Larissa's side jammed. She'd screamed as flames licked through the broken window, touching her face, her neck, her shoulder. A truck driver had finally pulled her free, but not before the damage was done. Her stepmother had survived with minor injuries. Larissa had spent 8 months in burn units and reconstructive surgeries. When she finally looked in a mirror, the girl she'd known was gone. The scars stretched from her left temple down across her cheek and jaw, textured and discolored. A permanent reminder of those terrible seconds. But worse than the physical scars was the way people looked at her afterward. The stares, the whispers, the carefully averted eyes. Friends stopped visiting. Her fiancé had ended their engagement with a phone call, unable to even face her. Her father, trying to protect her, had isolated her further. Clinton had told the press that Larissa was studying abroad. He'd kept her hidden in the family estate, believing he was sparing her from the world's cruelty. But all he'd done was convince her that she was something shameful, something to be concealed. Larissa had withdrawn completely. She'd stopped going outside except for medical appointments. She'd stopped looking at herself in mirrors. She'd stopped believing that anyone could look at her with anything other than pity or disgust. Her voice had become small, barely above a whisper. She had panic attacks in crowded spaces. The confident young woman had disappeared into someone who moved through the world like a ghost, always trying to take up less space, to be less visible, to disturb the world as little as possible. Her father, Clinton Harrington, was 60 years old and had the kind of power that came from decades of ruthless business decisions. He loved his daughter fiercely, protectively, but his love was controlling. He believed that only someone of equal wealth and status could truly value Larissa. He monitored her few outings. He had his security team report on anyone she spoke to. When he looked at the world, he saw threats and social climbers everywhere, and he was absolutely certain that a poor mechanic with a failed marriage had no place in his daughter's life. The meeting that would change everything happened on a cold January afternoon at the Scottsdale Fashion Square. Seraphina had begged Finn to take her shopping for a birthday present for her best friend. He'd agreed, even though it meant adding to the credit card debt he was already struggling with. They'd walked through the bright, crowded mall, Seraphina's small hand in his. Then Finn's ex-wife appeared. She'd come out of nowhere, materializing from the crowd like a bad dream. She wanted money. She wanted to see Seraphina. She wanted to disrupt the careful peace Finn had built. While Finn tried to handle the confrontation calmly, keeping his voice low so Seraphina wouldn't be scared, the little girl had slipped away. She'd seen her mother and panicked. Running blindly through the crowd, Finn's heart had stopped when he'd turned and found Seraphina gone. He'd called her name, pushing through the shoppers, his panic rising with every second. Meanwhile, across the mall, Larissa had been attempting one of her rare outings. She wore an oversized hoodie, sunglasses, and a medical mask that covered most of her face. She'd been standing near a fountain when she'd heard a child crying. Seraphina had been terrified, lost in the sea of strangers. When Larissa had knelt down, her mask had slipped. The little girl had looked directly at the burn scars covering half of Larissa's face. Larissa had frozen, waiting for the scream, for the fear, for the rejection she'd grown accustomed to. But Seraphina had only tilted her head, her tears pausing. She'd reached out one small finger and gently touched Larissa's scarred cheek. Her voice had been soft, full of concern rather than fear. "Does it hurt?" she'd asked. "You must have been very brave." Something inside Larissa had shattered. She'd started crying behind her sunglasses. No one had looked at her scars with compassion in 3 years. Everyone had either stared in horror or looked away in discomfort. But this 7-year-old child had seen only someone who had suffered and survived. Seraphina had put her small arms around Larissa's neck. "It's okay," the little girl had whispered. "You're still pretty. You just look like you fought a dragon." That was when Finn had found them. He'd been running, breathless and terrified, and then he'd seen his daughter safe in the arms of a hooded stranger. Larissa had stood quickly, her mask back in place, preparing for the man to snatch his child away from the frightening, scarred woman. Instead, Finn had dropped to his knees, looking at his daughter to make sure she was unhurt. And then he looked up at Larissa. His eyes had been warm with gratitude, not fear. "Thank you," he'd said, his voice thick with relief. "Thank you so much for keeping her safe." Larissa had barely been able to speak. She'd nodded, starting to back away. But Seraphina had grabbed her hand. "Daddy, she's nice," the little girl had insisted. "Can we buy her hot chocolate, please?" She helped me. Finn had smiled, and it had transformed his tired face into something gentle and genuine. "Of course we can," he'd said. He'd looked at Larissa. "If you'd like to join us, it's the least we can do." Larissa had wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to disappear back into her safe isolation. But there had been something in the way this man looked at her, something in the way his daughter held her hand without fear, that made her whisper okay before she could stop herself. They'd gone to a small cafe in the mall. Larissa had sat across from Finn and Seraphina, her hands shaking as she slowly removed her mask to drink. She'd felt every eye in the cafe turn toward her, heard the whispers, felt the familiar shame crawling up her spine. Her breathing had started to quicken, panic setting in. Then Finn had done something she'd never forget. He'd casually shifted his position, angling his body so that he blocked the stares from the other tables. He didn't make a big show of it. He didn't even acknowledge it. He just quietly positioned himself as a shield. Seraphina had chattered happily, completely unbothered by Larissa's scars. She talked about school and her favorite books and how her daddy worked really hard. But they were happy anyway. Finn had been warm but not intrusive, asking Larissa gentle questions. Where did she go to school? What did she like to do? He treated her like a person, not a curiosity, not a tragedy. When Seraphina had spilled her hot chocolate, Larissa had laughed. It had been a small sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine. Finn had noticed. He'd smiled at her, and for just a moment, Larissa had felt like the girl she used to be. The girl who laughed easily and didn't spend every moment convinced she was being judged. When they'd finally parted ways, Seraphina had hugged Larissa goodbye. "You look like a princess who fought a dragon and won," the little girl had declared seriously. "That makes you even braver than the princesses in my books." Larissa had cried in her car for an hour after they'd left. She'd cried because a child had seen her as brave instead of broken. She'd cried because a stranger had protected her without being asked. She'd cried because she'd forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a human being instead of a medical case or a source of pity. That night, back at the family estate, Larissa had found herself smiling at the memory. She'd hidden that smile like a treasure, pressing it into her pillow where no one could see, but her father had noticed the change in her. Clinton Harrington had security footage from the mall reviewed. When he'd seen his daughter talking to a man and child, he'd had them investigated. Within 24 hours, he'd known everything about Finn Carter. The failed marriage, the low income, the small apartment, the mountain of debt. Clinton had called Larissa into his study. "I know you met someone today," he'd said, his voice hard. "A mechanic, a single father, someone completely inappropriate." Larissa had felt her brief happiness crumble. "He was kind to me," she'd said quietly. "He didn't look at me like I was a monster." Her father's expression had softened slightly. "But not enough. People like that see opportunity when they look at our family. He's probably already planning how to exploit you." For the first time in 3 years, Larissa had felt anger instead of shame. "He didn't even know who I was," she'd said, her voice stronger. "He just saw someone who helped his daughter." Clinton had forbidden her from seeing Finn again. He'd threatened to cut off her access to therapy, to her small freedoms. But something had changed in Larissa. A small spark of defiance had been lit. She'd found Finn's number through the garage where he worked. She'd called him, her voice shaking, and asked if she could see him again, to thank him properly for being kind. Finn had been surprised, but pleased. "I'd like that," he'd said. "Seraphina hasn't stopped talking about the brave dragon-fighting princess." They'd agreed to meet at a small coffee shop the following week. Larissa had spent the days leading up to it in a state of anxiety and hope she'd thought she'd lost forever. She'd practiced in the mirror, trying to get used to her own reflection again. She'd chosen her clothes carefully, something that covered her scars but didn't look like she was hiding. The day of their meeting, Larissa had almost turned back 3 times on the drive over. When she'd parked outside the coffee shop and seen people through the windows, her chest had tightened. She'd sat in her car for 15 minutes, trying to breathe, trying to convince herself she could do this. Finally, she'd forced herself to walk to the door. The moment she'd stepped inside, she'd known it was a mistake. Every person in the cafe had turned to look. She'd heard the gasps, the sudden silence, the whispered, "Oh my God," from somewhere to her left. A woman had pulled her child behind her, as if Larissa's scars were contagious. A man had actually gotten up and moved to a different table. Larissa's vision had started to tunnel. Her hands had gone numb. She'd turned to leave, to run back to her car and never attempt this again. Then she'd heard Finn's voice. Larissa. She'd turned. And he'd been standing at a corner table where he'd been waiting. Seraphina had been with him, beaming. But what happened next was what changed everything. As Larissa had stood frozen in the doorway, trembling with humiliation, Finn had walked toward her. Not away, toward. He'd crossed the entire cafe while everyone watched. He'd walked right up to her and extended his hand. Not to shake, just to hold. "I'm glad you came," he'd said simply, his voice warm and steady. And then, in front of everyone, in front of all the stares and whispers and judgment, Finn Carter had taken Larissa Harrington's cold, shaking hand in his. He'd held it gently but firmly. He'd looked into her eyes, not at her scars, and smiled. "We saved you a seat," he'd said. "Right by the window." Seraphina insisted. The coffee shop had gone completely silent. Larissa had felt tears starting, but for once they weren't tears of shame. Finn had walked her to the table, still holding her hand, and pulled out her chair. Seraphina had immediately started chattering about her week, treating Larissa like an old friend, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. When Larissa had finally looked at Finn, really looked at him, she'd seen something in his eyes that she'd thought was lost to her forever. Acceptance. Not pity. Not horror. Not even inspiration porn admiration for her bravery. Just simple, genuine human warmth. He'd looked at her the way he might look at anyone. Like she was just a person. Like she was worth knowing. Finn had noticed a bead of perspiration running down from her hairline, crossing over her scarred tissue. Without thinking, without making it a big deal, he'd reached over and gently wiped it away with his napkin. The gesture had been so natural, so tender, that Larissa had felt something crack open inside her chest. When was the last time someone had touched her without hesitation? Without that fraction of a second flinch? They'd talked for 2 hours. Finn had told her about his work, about the satisfaction of fixing things that seemed broken beyond repair. He'd talked about Seraphina, about how she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, even though it had been terrifying to raise her alone. He'd been honest about his struggles, about the money problems and the exhaustion, but he'd said it without shame. Like poverty wasn't a moral failing, just a circumstance. Larissa had found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She'd told him about the accident, about the fear, about the isolation. Finn had listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes. When she'd finished, he'd simply said, "That sounds incredibly lonely. Not you're so brave, or at least you survived, or any of the other hollow phrases people offered. Just acknowledgement of her pain." That evening marked the beginning of everything, but it also marked the beginning of the storm. Clinton Harrington had been informed within hours that his daughter had been seen in public with the mechanic again. He'd been furious. The next morning, he'd arrived at the garage where Finn worked. He'd walked in wearing a $5,000 suit, flanked by 2 attorneys. The other mechanics had stopped working. Sensing trouble, Clinton had looked around the small, grimy shop with undisguised contempt before his eyes landed on Finn. "You're Finn Carter," he'd said. It wasn't a question. Finn had straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "I am. Can I help you?" Clinton had smiled, but it had been cold. "You can stay away from my daughter." The shop had gone silent. Finn had felt every eye on him. "With respect, sir, your daughter is an adult. She can make her own choices." Clinton's smile had disappeared. My daughter is vulnerable. She's been through trauma, and you're taking advantage of that. Finn had felt anger rising, but had kept his voice level. I'm not taking advantage of anyone. I'm just getting to know her. Clinton had stepped closer. Let me be very clear. I've had you investigated. Failed marriage? Debt? Working 2 jobs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. You think I don't know what you're after? You think I'll let someone like you exploit my daughter's loneliness for money? Finn had wanted to punch him. Instead, he'd taken a breath. I'm not after anything except maybe having a cup of coffee with someone who seems kind. But I understand you're protective. I would be too if Seraphina had been hurt the way Larissa was. Clinton had leaned in close. If you contact her again, I will destroy you. I will buy this garage and shut it down. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will take your daughter away from you through lawyers you can't afford to fight. Do you understand me? The threat about Seraphina had made Finn's blood run cold. He'd looked at the billionaire and seen that Clinton wasn't bluffing. This man had the power and the will to ruin him completely. Finn had nodded slowly. I understand. Clinton had left without another word. Finn had stood in the middle of the garage, shaking with rage and helplessness. His boss had put a hand on his shoulder. What was that about? Finn had just shaken his head. He couldn't explain how his brief moment of connection with someone had turned into a threat against everything he'd built for his daughter. That night, Finn had drafted a text to Larissa explaining that he couldn't see her anymore. But before he could send it, she'd called him. He'd been honest about his struggles, about the money problems and the exhaustion. But he'd said it without shame. Like poverty wasn't a moral failing, just a circumstance. Larissa had found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She'd told him about the accident, about the fear, about the isolation. Finn had listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes. When she'd finished, he'd simply said, "That sounds incredibly lonely." 40 minutes later, in the middle of a winter rainstorm, Larissa had arrived at his small apartment. She'd been soaked, her hair plastered to her face, her scars visible in the harsh hallway light. She'd been shaking from cold and emotion. "Can I come in?" she'd asked. Finn had pulled her inside, gotten her a towel, made her tea. They'd sat in his tiny living room while rain drummed against the windows. Seraphina had been asleep in the only bedroom. Larissa had looked around at the worn furniture, the patched walls, the small space where Finn and his daughter lived. Then she'd looked at Finn. "I'm tired of hiding," she'd said. "I'm tired of my father controlling everything. I'm tired of being treated like I'm too fragile to make my own choices." Tears had been running down her face, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. "You're the first person in 3 years who's treated me like I'm still human." He'd reached up and gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his fingers grazing her scars without hesitation. "You deserve to be seen, not hidden away, not protected from the world like you're something shameful. You survived something terrible, and you're still here. That makes you extraordinary." Larissa had leaned into his touch, and for a moment, they'd been so close that he'd felt her breath on his lips. "I don't want to let fear control me. I don't want to let my father decide who I'm allowed to care about." Finn had looked at their joined hands. He'd thought about Clinton's threats, about the risk to his job, to his custody of Seraphina. But he'd also thought about the woman sitting next to him, who was trying so hard to reclaim her life. "Your father could make things very difficult for me," he'd said honestly. "I have Seraphina to think about. I can't afford to lose my job or get into a legal battle." Larissa had nodded, understanding. "I know, and if you tell me you can't risk it, I'll understand." But I want you to know that you've already given me something precious. You've reminded me that I'm not unlovable, that someone can look at me and see a person worth knowing." Her voice had broken. "That's a gift I can't repay." They'd sat there in the dim apartment, the storm raging outside, both of them understanding that they were at a crossroads. Finally, Finn had spoken. "I grew up with nothing. I've been looked down on my whole life because I work with my hands instead of in an office. I've had people dismiss me as worthless because I don't have money or status." He'd met her eyes. "But I've never let anyone make me feel like I was less than human, and I won't let your father do that to you either." But her father had noticed the change in her. Clinton Harrington had security footage from the mall reviewed. When he'd seen his daughter talking to a man and child, he'd had them investigated. Within 24 hours, he'd known everything about Finn Carter: the failed marriage, the low income, the small apartment, the mountain of debt. Clinton had called Larissa into his study. "I know you met someone today," he'd said, his voice hard. "A mechanic. A single father." But before they could cross that line, a camera flash had lit up the window. They'd both jumped. Finn had rushed to the window and seen a photographer running to a car. Paparazzi. Someone had tipped them off that the billionaire's scarred daughter was at a poor mechanic's apartment late at night. The photos had hit the internet within hours. By morning, it was everywhere. Billionaire's burn-scarred daughter in secret romance with struggling single dad. The comments had been vicious, people calling Larissa desperate, calling Finn a gold digger. Clinton Harrington's lawyers had issued statements. The media had descended. At first, Larissa had wanted to hide again. The exposure, the scrutiny, the judgment. It was everything she'd feared. But then, she'd seen the way Finn had handled it. He'd given one statement to the press: "Larissa Harrington is a kind, intelligent woman who deserves privacy and respect. What we have is between us, not the public." He hadn't apologized, hadn't justified, hadn't made excuses. Watching him stand up to the media storm with quiet dignity had given Larissa courage. She'd done something she'd never done before. She'd agreed to one interview, on her terms. She'd sat in front of a camera without hiding her scars and told her story. Not the fairy tale romance version the media wanted. The real story. About the accident. About the isolation. About learning that her worth wasn't determined by her appearance or her father's money. "Do you understand what that means to me?" Finn had moved closer, sitting beside her on his threadbare couch. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he'd said gently. "You don't owe me anything for being decent." Larissa had shaken her head. "That's exactly why I want to keep seeing you. Because you think basic decency is just what you owe people." She'd reached out and taken his hand, the same way he'd taken hers in the coffee shop. "I don't want to hide anymore. I need to tell you something about the accident," he'd said. Larissa had felt fear spike through her. For 3 years, she'd carried the guilt. She'd been the one asking her stepmother to drive faster. She'd been the one who'd wanted to take the shortcut. She'd believed that the accident was fundamentally her fault. "Your stepmother," Clinton had said quietly, "swerved to avoid hitting a child who ran into the road. The accident report confirms it. The driver of the other car admitted he ran a red light. You didn't cause this, Larissa. Neither did she. It was just a terrible accident." The file had slipped from Larissa's hands. 3 years. 3 years of carrying guilt that wasn't hers to carry. 3 years of believing she deserved the pain because she'd caused it. "Your stepmother tried to tell you," Clinton had continued, "after the accident. But you were so traumatized, you couldn't hear it. And he'd paused, his voice breaking. "I was so focused on protecting you from the world that I never made sure you understood. I'm sorry. Larissa had collapsed. Not from physical pain, but from the weight of that guilt finally lifting. Finn had been there within minutes of her call. He'd held her while she cried not tears of sadness, but of release. "I'm not broken because I deserve to be," she'd whispered into his shoulder. "I'm not being punished." Finn had held her tighter. "You were never being punished, and you were never broken." The revelation had shifted something fundamental. Clinton, seeing his daughter in pain, seeing how this mechanic held her with such tenderness, had begun to understand. This wasn't about money or status. This was about his daughter finally finding someone who saw her completely, scars and all, and chose to stay. Clinton had shown up at Finn's apartment the next day. This time, alone. No lawyers, no threats. He'd looked at the small space where Finn was raising his daughter, and something in his expression had softened. "My daughter loves you," he'd said simply. It wasn't a question. Finn had met his eyes. "I'm not sure about love yet, but I care about her deeply. And I think she's one of the bravest people I've ever met." Clinton had been quiet for a long moment. "I've spent 3 years trying to protect her from a world that hurt her. But I was really just keeping her prisoner." But it was the beginning of peace. The media had eventually moved on to other stories. The initial frenzy died down. What remained was something quieter and more real. Finn and Larissa continued seeing each other, building something genuine away from cameras and judgment. Seraphina adored Larissa, who taught her piano and read her stories. Larissa, for her part, started therapy again, this time focused on reclaiming her life rather than just surviving. A year passed. "I need to tell you something about the accident," he'd said. Larissa had felt fear spike through her. For 3 years, she'd carried the guilt. She'd been the one asking her stepmother to drive faster. She'd been the one who'd wanted to take the shortcut. She'd believed that the accident was fundamentally her fault. "Your stepmother," Clinton had said quietly, "swerved to avoid hitting a child who ran into the road. The accident report confirms it." He'd looked at Finn. "You don't have money. You don't have status. But you gave her something I couldn't. You made her feel human again." Finn had nodded slowly. "She did the same for me. I'd convinced myself I wasn't worth loving because my ex-wife left. Larissa showed me that was a lie." Clinton had extended his hand. "I'm not saying this will be easy. I'm not promising I won't worry about her every day. But I won't stand in your way anymore." It wasn't a blessing exactly. She threw her arms around Larissa. "Mom, Larissa, take a picture with me." Larissa had frozen. She looked at Finn, questions in her eyes. Seraphina had never called her that before. Finn had smiled gently and nodded. Seraphina snapped a selfie with Larissa, both of them laughing, the scars visible but somehow irrelevant in the moment of pure joy. When Seraphina ran off to explore again, Finn turned to Larissa. He took her hand, the same gesture that had started everything in that coffee shop a year ago. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was serious but warm. "I fell in love with you months ago. I didn't say it because I wanted you to have space to heal, to figure out who you are outside of the trauma, but I can't keep it in anymore." Larissa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have since that day in the coffee shop, when you held my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world." Finn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple silver ring. Not expensive, he couldn't afford expensive, but chosen with care. "I'm not asking you to marry me yet," he said. "I know we're still figuring things out, but I want you to know I'm serious about this. About us. About building a life together if you want that." Larissa took the ring with shaking hands. She slipped it onto her finger. "I want that," she said. "I want all of it." They kissed in the meadow, while Seraphina picked flowers in the distance, and for the first time in 4 years, Larissa felt completely, unreservedly happy. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the three of them walked back to the car. Larissa held Finn's hand on one side and Seraphina's on the other. Her scars caught the warm light, visible to anyone who might look. But she didn't hide them anymore. She didn't shrink or apologize for existing. She walked with her head up, part of a family that chose each other not despite their brokenness, but with full awareness of it. In the car, Seraphina fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the day. Finn glanced over at Larissa in the passenger seat. The setting sun illuminated her profile, scarred and beautiful, strong and gentle, everything she was. "Thank you," he said quietly. Larissa looked at him. "For what?" Finn smiled. "For being brave enough to walk into that coffee shop. For letting me see you. For choosing to build something instead of hiding." Larissa leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for holding my hand," she said. "That first time, when everyone was watching. You have no idea what that meant." They drove home through the desert sunset, three people who had found each other in unlikely circumstances. The mechanic who'd thought himself unworthy of love. The woman who'd thought her scars made her unlovable. The little girl who'd brought them together with nothing but pure, uncomplicated acceptance. They weren't a perfect family by society's standards. They didn't have wealth or status or conventional beauty, but they had something more valuable than all of that. They had chosen each other. They had looked past the surface, past the poverty and the scars and the judgment, and seen what mattered. Human hearts that were willing to be brave enough to love. And in the end, that was everything.